looks like. So the media really understands what pornography is. And in Details magazine, which is a kind of cosmopolitan for men, they had an article called How Internet Porn is Changing Teen Sex. And they quoted Joanna Angel, who calls herself a feminist pornographer. I'm sorry, but you can't be a feminist and a pornographer. You have to make a decision. The first rule of feminism is do no harm to women. And pornography is one of the most harmful aspects of our culture today. So she's obviously a pornographer, not a feminist. And these women who call themselves ethical pornographers or whatever, just wrapping themselves in the flag of feminism as a way to create a niche market. This is just the monetization of feminism. So anyway, she said something really interesting. She said, the girls these days, they just seem to come to the set porn ready. Now, it's clear that not all girls and women are going to end up on a porn set. And in fact, what she's saying is way more profound. What she's saying is that we are now socializing an entire generation of girls to think of themselves as disposable porn objects, or in another way to put it, disposable fuck objects. So we need to look at how we're socializing our girls in this way. And of course, the major form of socialization today is the image. Now, we used to live in a print-based culture. Many of us on this webinar were brought up in a print-based culture. And as Neil Postman said, when we lived in a print-based culture, we developed some immunization to the seduction of eloquence of the printed word. We have no such immunization to the seduction of eloquence of the image. And we know that now, thanks to MRI machines, where they see the images bypass the frontal lobes, the executive part of our brain, and land in that part of the brain that doesn't do rational discourse. So imagine growing up today, an image after image of white, young, toned women, all of whom have been, of course, airbrushed to so-called perfection, are just thrown at you. And this is what it means in a porn culture to be female. God forbid anything jiggles other than the breasts. You have to be bolted down flesh-wise. And then we ask, why do so many girls and women have eating disorders? Now, when we see how they're clothed in pop culture, we also see that this used to be in porn like 20 years ago. Today, this is mainstream, thanks to Victoria's Secrets. And we see this kind of imagery, which is extremely pornified, these clothes everywhere. Now, I want to talk about clothing. These are images from the Met Gala. Now, look at how these women are walking around, not to mention that they all look anorexic to start with. And that's the normalization of this very extremely thin looking body that no healthy woman can sustain. And also notice the clothes. We never see men walking around with their, for example, testicles hanging out. They're always fully clothed, and those who are clothed are protected. And it's a political position who gets to be clothed and who gets to be unclothed in the face of clothed people. It's no accident that when in prison, the first thing you're made to do is strip, because it is an excellent way to signify who has power and who doesn't. Now, when we look at the discourse around women of colour, especially African-American women, what we see is they're often either dressed in animal skins or they have animal skins painted on them. And this is a discourse that comes right down from slavery, where the argument was that African-American women are just so hyper-sexualized, so animalistic, so out of control, that you actually can't blame the poor white slave owners for raping them. And in fact, it wasn't rape because these women wanted it. This hypersexualization of Black women is a trope that legitimized the wholesale rape of Black women on the plantations and continues today in mainstream media. So when you're looking around, have a look for how African-American women are represented. So this is the choice we offer girls. We offer them either conformity or invisibility. Another way to put this is fuckability or invisibility. You either have to look fuckable or you're rendered invisible. And when I say this, when I'm giving lectures to high schools or college students, the women and girls gasp because they know this is their life. This is not a choice that they have decided upon. This has been foisted on them by the porn culture. And if you want to look visible, you have to dress in a pornified way. And after the lectures, I have a group of women crying, wanting to tell me about their stories. And a lot will say, you know what? I chose fuckability because I don't want to be alone, but I hate it. And then I have a smaller group of women crying, saying, I chose invisibility. I hate it, but I couldn't do fuckability and I'm alone all the time. So these are the choices we have offered our young girls. And this is the way that we are slowly stripping away from them agency. I mean, it always amazes me, this third wave neoliberalism, feminism that talks about agency. We have done nothing but strip agency off these girls piece by piece by piece. Now, the APA report, American Psychological Association report on hypersexualized culture, showed that the more girls learn to sexually objectify, the more likely they are to have anxiety and depression, body loathing, risky sexual behavior, early pregnancy, STIs, suicidal ideation, self-harming, dropping out of school, and sexual victimization. So this is telling you something about the effects that it has when you are basically rendered invisible by a culture unless you're hypersexualized. Now, what are the effects of this? Well, when I was writing Pornland, I was really struggling because I noticed a difference in my students and I couldn't put my hand on it. And who really gave me insight was not actually sociologist, a psychologist, a media theorist. It was actually an incarcerated child molester who I like to call Dick. Now, Dick was a particularly unpleasant human being, as they all were. I was interviewing 8 men in prison, all of whom had downloaded child sexual abuse images, all went on to rape a child. And the time between downloading the images and raping a child was about 6 months to a year. So Dick is explaining to me how he, quote, groomed his daughter. This was the word he was talking about, his stepdaughter, who he then went on to rape. And he was using the word grooming all the time just to show me how smart he was. So then at one point he looks at me and he said something that forever changed the way I feel. He said, the culture did a lot of the grooming for me. And I have to say, I almost fell off my chair. It was like, my God, this is the bit I've been missing. That in fact, we not only have individual perpetrators grooming individual girls, we now have a culture grooming en masse girls to think of themselves as fuck objects. And go back to what Joanna Angel said a few slides ago, the girls today come to the set porn ready. It's no accident that the pornographer and the child molester almost say the same thing, because they get what the culture is doing. So I want us to think now that we live in a perp culture that is perpetrating against our girls, turning them into usually fuckability. Now I want to move over into where this is coming from. And one of the things I want to talk about specifically is how pornography has changed. One of the problems is that often people think pornography is like Playboy. Forget it, it's gone. Playboy's bankrupt. The only thing it makes money from is its bunny logo. So this is not pornography. So who tells us it's pornography? Again, Details magazine in the same article. There's an entire generation of young people who think sex ends with a money shot to the face. Now, a money shot is ejaculation in the face. Increasingly in pornography, it's in the eyes, to the point that we now have an antibiotic-resistant strain of gonorrhea of the eye going around the porn industry. So thinking about this, when you look at studies and male college students are asked, what are the sex acts you really want to do? Coming on your face, as they put it, is actually number 1 or 2. Now, when I was growing up, if a guy would have said to me, can I come on your face? You know, I would have thought he was a sociopath. I would have ran a mile. It has now, thanks to pornography, become completely normalized. And in a recent study where you had this great interviewer and she asked guys, why do you want to come on her face? And they said, oh, because it gives me power. I look down and she's down there. But when she dug a little bit deeper, what she found is they said they really like it because they know she hates it. So here we are bringing up a generation of boys and men who get off on the fact that the sex acts they're doing, they know the women and the girls hate it. How did we get here? How did we get to this place where you can get to body punishing, cruel, violent pornography within 5 seconds for free? That's mainstream porn today. I want to be very clear here that what I'm talking about, the body punishing, cruel, torturous sex acts that are done to these women, is mainstream. I don't go anywhere near the hardcore end of the market. I don't go anywhere near the dark web. I actually follow the breadcrumbs of an 11-year-old, which is the average age of first viewing these images. So the domestication of the internet, bringing the internet into the home, made porn more affordable, accessible, and anonymous. The 3 A's, which are the drivers of demand. Porn sites get more visitors each month than Netflix, Amazon, and Twitter combined. Not only that, they also harvest more data on their users than any other organization or business enterprise. So they make money often by selling on the data to other porn sites. So the flagship porn site of the porn industry, owned by MindGeek, which is the Amazon of pornography, is Pornhub. And this has, just to give you an idea, 47 billion visits a year, 130 million daily, and 5 million new videos added each year. And even if you live to be 1,000, you couldn't get through a tiny percentage of the amount of videos on Pornhub. Now, 100 million daily visits is as if the combined population of Canada, Poland, Netherlands, and Australia visited Pornhub every day. This is not some small underground industry. This is a major above ground industry, multi-billion dollars, completely unregulated. Whenever I argue that we need to regulate this industry out of existence, people say, well, what will happen if it goes underground? And my argument is that's exactly where it should be. Because when it's above ground, it interfaces with all of mainstream capital, from Amazon to Netflix, to Snapchat, to Instagram, to Visa, MasterCard, to venture capitalists. This is how MindGeek started. He got money from JP Morgan, about $380 million. So this is how these things start. So anyone who argues that pornography should be below ground does not have an understanding of how capitalism works and what happens when you're knitted into mainstream capitalism, as the industry is. Now, what do we see when we go to pornography? And this is where it gets difficult. So I'm just telling you, what's the content? Well, we know from the gold standard study of Anna Bridges and her team that of the 304 scenes, most watched scenes, 90% contained at least one form of violence against women. Anna and her team is now doing a new study, and that 90% is no longer 90%. It's now at 100%, which anyone who looks at porn should not be surprised. So what are the main acts? Gagging is the #1 act. Now, gagging needs to be separated from strangulation. Gagging is where the penis is so far down the throat she can't breathe, and the tears are pouring out of her eyes. She can't breathe. Sometimes she vomits. And as she's fighting a guy away who's got the penis down her throat, he gets the back of her head and he pulls it even closer to her, so she chokes even more. So I don't know if he's a real life sociopath or not, but he's certainly acting as if one, and this is what the boys are looking at. The second major act, which is actually deadly, is strangulation. This often gets called rough sex. Now, strangulation is hands around the throat. Anyone putting your hands around your throat for any period of time is potentially deadly. It cuts off oxygen to the airways, which can cause an immediate stroke, a heart attack. It can also cause death in the long run. So this is one of the major acts. And a recent study asked incoming women in their first year of university about their last sexual experience, not their entire sexual experience, their last one. And 1 in 3 said they had been strangled. Now, just imagine this. It's almost like, I feel like I'm making this up, but these are peer-reviewed studies. The others are rough anal sex to the point that they are pounding so hard into her anus that women in the porn industry suffer from anal prolapses, which is literally where the anus drops out of the body and has to get sewn up. This is why most women only last for 3 months. We said ejaculation, spitting on the face, hair pulling, hitting, and ATM, which is ass to mouth, where the penis is put into her anus and then without washing straight into her mouth. And the joke is the bitch has to eat her own shit. Now, this is your standard scene of all of these. One woman with 3 guys orally, anally, vaginally penetrating her, calling her bitch, whore, cunt, cum dumpster, hitting her, spitting in her face, and then ejaculating all over her. So she's got ejaculate streaming down her face. And when I watch this, I think to myself, if that happened to me, I would die, literally. I don't know how I'd ever get up. And how on earth would I get up and do the same thing the next day and the day after and the day after? So when women in the industry refer to themselves as, quote, sex workers, it's not, I don't think that they truly believe that. It's that in order to survive, they have to build a narrative that this isn't, they're not getting raped every day, that in fact they made a choice, which they didn't, of course, because we know they're poor, often got history of sexual abuse. But this is a psychological mechanism, because if not, you would fracture psychologically if you had to do this every single day and realize that in fact what's happening to you is rape, rape, and rape. So let me give you an example of what they say on the website as a way to keep the younger boys and men on. Do you know what we say to things like romance and foreplay? We say fuck off. We take gorgeous young bitches and do what every man would really like to do. We make them gag, etc., and I give them a sticky bath, which means ejaculation. Now, how clever is this for young boys? The average age, again, is 11. We take your gorgeous young bitches and do what every man would really like to do. Not true. Every man does not want to do this. We know that, but yet these are 11-year-old boys, and even boys as young as 7 now looking at pornography. They've got no sexual history, repertoire of anything. This is their first introduction. Pornography is today the world's major form of sex education. So how can they argue with this? Because they're telling them, we know what you really want. Your hands are dirty before you've even dirtied them, because we know you in ways you don't know yourself. Another example from the scenes in Anally Ripped Whores. This is the promotional copy. We at Pure Filth know exactly what you want. Chicks being ass fucked till their sphincters are pink, puffy, and totally blown out. Adult diapers just might be in store for these whores when their work is done. Now, I want to say I got to all of these within 5 seconds, which means that your average kid gets there in 3 seconds. Right now, again, we at Pure Filth know exactly what you want. No, you don't. Do not tell me that 11, 12, 13, 14, even 15-year-old boy is going on looking for this. When boys type into pornography, into Google, butts or titties or something like this, they don't type in porn. They think if they're lucky, they're going to see a pair of breasts. If they're really lucky, they're going to see a naked body. What they get catapulted into is a world of sexual torture. Now think of that 11-year-old boy watching this, being told this is who he is and this is what he wants. Think of that toxic stew in his stomach of self-loathing, arousal, self-disgust, all those things turning around in his stomach. And he's got nowhere to go. Because, by the way, we know that the first thing that trauma cuts off is the ability to speak, to find words. And I would argue this is traumatizing. I mean, I know that I get traumatized from watching these scenes. What does an 11-year-old boy get? So once you traumatize a generation of boys, which is what we're doing now, you know who pays the price? Girls and women. Right? This has a massive domino effect, not on just on the boys, but on the girls and the women. So what do we know about the impact of porn? We know the behavioral risks are erectile dysfunction, low libido, difficulty orgasming, and a preference for pornography over actual sex with a partner. This is increasingly happening. This is what we're finding in the research. It causes physical and or verbal violence against women, sexual aggression, sexual coercion, negative attitudes, and also encourages boys to bully girls into sexting. It gives risky consensual sexual scripts, increases the objectification of women. It causes the creation of a disintegrated, inauthentic sexual identity on the part of men and those women who watch it. And again, every time you do this to men, women pay the price. And it causes alienation from self and others. And it avoids avoidance of emotion and limits capacity for empathy. Now think of this last bit. If you limit the capacity for empathy, you're creating monsters. What stops us doing terrible things to other people is the capacity for empathy and compassion. That's what stops me harming other people. And you know what? If you take that away from boys and men, we see now the results. The level of violence against women and children is through the roof, and it's only increasing. It also undermines self-awareness, self-regulation, impulse control, poorer body image, and more likely to be depressed and anxious. What we also know is there is a causal relationship, not correlational, causal, which is the gold standard, which boys who intentionally sought out porn are 6 times more likely to self-report sexually aggressive behavior. They're more likely to want to try what they've seen, more likely to sexually harass, and more likely to engage in problematic sexual behaviors. This is a longitudinal study. It's again, the prize in social sciences, longitudinal studies that are causation rather than correlation. Now, where are we going? This is in 2003. Jules Jordan, who is a hardcore pornographer, said one of the things about today's porn and the extreme porn market, the gonzo market, that's extreme, so many fans want to see so much more. This is in 2003, just 3 years after the porn industry started to cannibalize the internet. So where do we go? Children. The extreme is children. This is not taken from those images called child sexual abuse images. This is taken from mainstream porn sites where either she might be 18 or under, we don't know because they don't follow any rules to see, or she might be 18 and above but made to look very young. But look at how she looks with the Disney figures. This is all over Pornhub. They also have, it's one of the best-selling series, is Okay, She's My Stepdaughter. And let me read you this. These young stepdaughters may seem innocent, but don't let them fool you. As soon as mom leaves the house, stepdaddy's cock becomes the target and the only thing that will calm the aching, throbbing, dripping pussy she's been playing with all day. These girls crave cock and will find any reason to get it from their new stepdads. We know a lot of men seek out women who've got children so they have easy access to the children. Also notice, she's the slut, right? She's the whore, she wants it. This basically takes away responsibility from the men because they're saying, look, you're doing her a favor, right? They're putting it on her as a way to groom him into becoming a child sex offender. The most searched for term in Pornhub in 2022 is hentai. This is what study found, that children aged 6 to 12 compared to adults are disproportionately exposed to pornography sites specializing in non-photographic content. That non-photographic content is hentai. It's the Japanese phrase for sexual perversion. It's cartoon characters. They typically look like kids, but they're hypersexualized. So on the left, to my left, you're looking at an orgy of Disney princesses. Right, so this is the pornification of childhood. And then look at how she looks in hentai with the teddy bear. And then this is the BDSM of hentai. This is all legal, perfectly legal, because not one country has the backbone to do anything about the porn industry. So we are putting our children at risk at a level that we've never done before. Hentai and pornographic animation promote an interest in abusive relationships and or might constitute non-photographic images of child sexual abuse. This was from a report by the British Board of Film Classification. Now, the really awful stuff is this study by Heather Wood. Clinical experience and research evidence are now accumulating to suggest that the internet is not simply drawing attention to those with existing pedophile interests, but is contributing to the crystallization of those interests in men, they say people, with no explicit sexual interest in children. Do you know what they're saying? That through the use of pornography, mainstream pornography, you are basically creating a class of men who are not pedophiles because they prefer sex with adult women, but who develop a sexual interest in children. Those 8 men I interviewed in prison, where Dick was telling me about how he groomed his stepdaughter, not one of them was a pedophile. When I asked them if they were a pedophile, they were insulted. They said, no, we prefer sex with adult women. I said, then why did you rape a child? You know what they said? We got bored with the usual pornography. We wanted something new. They got bored. So they blow up all these lives. So now you've got to get your head around non-pedophile men raping children, which now expands the number of children who are at risk of being raped. So this is it. Desensitization, boredom, addiction to pornography leads to legal childified images like the ones I showed you from Pornhub, which leads to actual child sexual abuse images. So we are going down an incredible rabbit hole here when it comes to women and kids, and here especially kids. So we have to change our toxic culture. We simply cannot allow this. We have to work on the macro, the meso, and the micro. As a sociologist and a radical feminist, of course, I'm always drawn to the macro. Public health approach, we've developed a public health approach at Culture Reframed, which basically we work with educators, activists, youth and family advocates, parents groups, and medical health experts. We have started to partner with lots and lots of groups in order to give lectures and to help them figure out what's going on with pornography. Now, coming soon, within the next month, we are launching the first ever sex education curriculum with a porn critical lens. It's online. I have to say, of all the programs that Culture Reframed has produced, this is the very best. If you're interested in this, you can send me an email and I've got my contact address later. But if you're going to teach sex education, you have to include a critical analysis of pornography. You don't show pornography because it's for 13 to 18-year-olds, but our lesson plans are based on anti-exploitation and understanding pornography and the sex industry as forms of exploitation. And then we move into healthy sex and relationships. It can be used across a term or semester for 14 weeks. It can also, by the way, be used in colleges. You can download it, you can customize it for your students. And if you get in touch with us, and I'll tell you how later. So we work with the child advocacy centres, of which there are 915 in the country. We work with domestic and sexual violence organisations. We work a lot in hospitals with paediatricians and forensic and SANE nurses, that's sexual assault nurse examiners. We work with anti-trafficking organisations and legal juvenile court, because you're never going to stop trafficking till you stop pornography. So what can we do? So government legislation and regulation define porn as non-state torture, just as there are people trying to define trafficking as non-state torture. Hold porn sites financially accountable. Withdraw of all credit card payment systems so they can't afford, so they'll make no money. End to corporate social responsibility. No capitalist organizations should self-regulate. If we ask the tobacco industry tomorrow to self-regulate, they'd be handing cigarettes out at elementary school. We need legislation. Enforce age verification for production and consumption, and we can talk about how you do that in the Q&A. And most importantly, expand the equality model to cover porn. Pornography is prostitution with the camera going. Why we've separated it, I have no idea. So we already have great legislation in the equality model. Let's now include the production and consumption of pornography. You want to contact us? You can contact either me, G Dines, at culturereframed.org, or just put me into Google and I come up. Or Amanda Sanchez, who is our program director, or just go on to Culture Reframed and sign up, and you'll get newsletters, and we'll let you know when our new curriculum is ready. So I want to say one thing. I am very concerned with where radical feminism is going. It seems to me that the fight against male violence, and especially pornography and trafficking, has been taken over by a lot of the faith-based groups who have written out the history of our movement. We need to start focusing on this again. Remember, the radical feminists were there first. We were the first to talk about pornography as hate crime, as sexual abuse, and not as a joke at the end, not as a joke, which is considered by many. And I'm so glad that so many of you joined today. But let me say, how many did we get? We got 29. Thank you so much. We should have 29,000 here. This is critical. We are going over the edge of a cliff with pornography. If we continue to bring up another generation of boys, we are going to finish this culture, because to have these sociopaths walking around who've been trained to have no empathy is the end of women and children. We're done for. We're finished. So I ask you to think about activism. Join us at Culture Reframed. We are building a movement, and at the center of that is arguing that we have to stop male violence against women. And one of the major causes of that is the commercial sex industry. So again, I thank you for coming today, and I'm looking forward to hearing Meredith. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gail. So we're going to move on to Meredith. Meredith Kershaw is an Australian-born attorney living in New Jersey with experience practicing law in Australia and New York. She is deeply interested in protecting the human rights of women and girls, having served as a federal prosecutor for the Australian Prosecution Service, specializing in the prosecution of crimes involving human exploitation, particularly child pornography offenses. Meredith is an advocate for the equality model, and we'll hear a lot about that, which is a holistic legal approach to addressing prostitution, and has authored a report by New Yorkers for the equality model entitled, "Is Decriminalizing of the Sex Trade the Answer?" Debunking the ACLU's report. Meredith is a commercial litigator with a boutique law firm, Wasserman Grubin Rogers, LLP in New York, and will commence a Master's of Law at Columbia University in the fall of 2023. Welcome, Meredith.
Well, thank you very much, Anne, and thank you, Gail, for that incredibly informative presentation. Thank you all for being with us to discuss these critical topics. I would like to reiterate the trigger warning that Gail issued. I'm going to be talking about some really disturbing and serious sexual abuses. If that's too much for you, please drop off at any time. I'd like to share the stories of 3 women. Alina is from San Andrei, a poor village in Romania with rundown houses and muddy paths. Some 80% of its younger residents are unemployed, and a family can count itself lucky if it owns a garden to grow vegetables and potatoes. Alina's father drank and beat his wife and sometimes abused his daughter. At 22, Alina had no money and no job. Through a friend's new boyfriend, Alina heard about the possibilities available in Germany. She learned that a person in prostitution could earn €900 or about $1,200 US a month there. Alina began thinking about the idea. Anything seemed better than San Andrei. I thought I'd have my own room, a bathroom, and not too many customers, she said. In the summer of 2009, she and her friend got into her boyfriend's car and drove through Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic until they reached the German capital, not the trendy Mitte neighborhood in the heart of the city, but near Schönefeld Airport, where the name of the establishment alone said something about the owner. Airport Muskus which is translated to airport pussies. The brothel specialized in flat rate sex. For €100, a customer could have sex for as long and as often as he wanted. It all went very quickly, says Alina. There were other Romanians there who knew the man who had brought them there. She was told to hand over her clothes, and she was given revealing lingerie to wear instead. Only a few hours after her arrival, she was expected to greet her first customers. She says that when she wasn't nice enough to the customers, the Romanians reduced her wages. The Berlin customers paid their fee at the entrance. Many took drugs to improve their sexual performance and could last all night. A line often formed around Alina's room. She says that eventually she stopped counting how many men got into her bed. I blocked it out, she says. There were so many every day. Alina says that she and other women were required to pay the pimps €800 a week. She shared a bed and a sleeping room with 3 other women. There was no other furniture. All she saw of Germany was the Esso gas station around the corner, where she was allowed to go buy cigarettes and snacks, but only in the company of a guard. The rest of the time, says Alina, she was kept locked up in the club. The Romanians kept Alina in line by threatening to harm her family. When she occasionally spoke to her mother on the phone, she lied and said how nice it was in Germany. Prosecutors learned that the women in the club had to offer vaginal, oral, and anal sex and serve several men at the same time in so-called gangbang sessions. The men didn't always use condoms. I was not allowed to say no to anything, says Alina. During menstruation, she would insert sponges into her vagina so that customers wouldn't notice. Chelsea Geddes was prostituted at a New Zealand brothel. Of her experience, she recalls, there weren't any friendly gentlemen. These were rapists. Even accepting that you had to have sex, they constantly pressured and forced more. They rip condoms off, they try to kiss you and shove their tongue down your throat. They viciously bite necks and nipples, smack and swear at you. They ask for discounts. They want to do it twice, 3 and 4 times, but they don't want to pay twice, 3 and 4 times. On a busy shift, I might have 7 or 8 bookings, making my genitals red, raw, and swollen. And even at the end of the shift, when we were paid out, there was no guarantee they'd hand over our money. They might write on an envelope that they owe us X amount of money, so we have to come in and work another shift to get it. Sometimes it built up for so long that I worried if I'd be paid at all. Ugly, smelly, fat, drug-addled men pounded away on top of me, dripping cold sweat onto my skin and in my eyes. I got ear infections because I would turn my head so they couldn't try and kiss me, and they would pant moisture into my eardrum instead. All you can do is continue to firmly state your boundaries while trying not to make them angry. Some men were easier compared to others, but they were all ultimately the same. My human rights to bodily integrity, safety, free expression, to not endure torture had been sold. The brothel streams porn to the rooms, which encourages the men to pressure us for any number of bizarre, dangerous, unhygienic, and degrading acts against our bodies, because they're seeing those other poor girls experience them on screen. Finally, I will share Jamie's story. I've substituted a handful of words she uses that I find personally triggering, but otherwise this is her voice. As a 15-year-old homeless runaway living on the streets of Melbourne, Australia, I met apparently friendly older men around the age of 20 or so, who offered me a hotel room to stay in if I would help them sell newspapers on the corner. At the time, I thought they were being kind. It was soon made very evident that there was an extra price for this roof over my head. There began a steady stream of strangers coming to my room and expecting all kinds of sex from me. It was a tiny room with just a single bed and a bedside table. I was not allowed to leave it for any reason other than to use the bathroom down the hall. All I can really recall from those days are the smell of bad breath, body odor, and fresh semen as the faces and ages of all the men mingle in my nightmares. I cannot even tell you how long I was trapped in that hotel as each day and night blurred into the next. I remember the pain of having penises shoved in any hole they could and as hard as they could until they would grunt when they were done using my body. By 21, my idea of legal brothel work was a nice, clean place, nice men who would pay good money to have sex with me, a safe working environment because it was all legal, right? I'd been having sex with men I didn't like for years, so why not get paid for it in a legitimate business? A friendly lady met me and took me inside and showed me around the nice-looking spa rooms and explained I could earn a lot of money being a fresh face and so pretty. At 80 to 90 Australian dollars an hour, I thought, how hard could it be? I had arrived just before lunchtime and was told I could start immediately as they were expecting to be busy. I quickly learned that there was such a thing as a 15-minute booking for $50 cost to the punter, of which I received 25. There was no nice spa room for that. Instead, I was put in a tiny little room with a huge two-way mirror. I had sex with old men, ugly men, savage men who would pin me down and grind their hips into my thighs till I felt like they would dislocate. Drunk men who would get angry and demand a refund because they couldn't orgasm after an hour. Entitled men who felt they had paid for the right to use my body in any way, shape, or form they wanted to. Perverted men who paid me more to wear a school uniform and call them daddy. Strange men who paid extra for me to wear large dildos while they masturbated. Bastard men who only wanted it doggy style so they could attempt to slip the condom off. Men coming straight from a factory job covered in grease and dirt with filthy hands and nails, wanting to shove as many dirty fingers into my vagina as they could. Off I went to bookings at men's homes, workplaces, or wherever, never knowing if tonight was going to be my last night alive if I displeased the John with no one to intervene. Would my child be left growing up to discover mum was a dead prostitute? I learned how to negotiate enough to get myself out of some pretty scary situations with Johns who were drunk or high. Well, besides suffering horrific sexual abuse, what do Alina, Chelsea, and Jamie have in common? They were all legally prostituted. The sex trade, and by that I mean the system that facilitates the buying and selling of sex, is legal and decriminalized in Germany, New Zealand, and Melbourne, Australia, and has been for roughly 20 years. Remember Alina's story and the airport Muscus brothel in Sconfeld where she was prostituted? Well, that brothel no longer exists. It's been replaced by Club Erotica, which does not offer flat rates. But Johns still have plenty of choice in the area. A few kilometres away in Skonberg, the King George has switched to flat rate pricing. Its management uses the slogan, Geis macht geil, which loosely translates as being cheap makes you horny. For €99, clients can enjoy sex and drinks until the establishment closes. Anal sex, unprotected oral sex, and kissing with tongue are extra. The King George offers a gangbang party on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. In fact, Germany has multiple mega brothels where punters can order from a menu of women. For example, if it suits their predilection, they can order one or even multiple pregnant women. All of this is completely legal. Legalized and decriminalized systems of prostitution are essentially the same. The only difference is that in legalized environments, governments create bodies that are supposed to specifically regulate the sex industry, whereas in decriminalized systems, people involved in the sex trade, including pimps, brothel owners, those in prostitution, are supposed to use the ordinary regulatory bodies to get the requisite business permits to operate. In both systems, governments profit from taxes and tourism revenue raised by the sex trade. When so-called sex worker advocates push for decriminalization or legalization of the sex trade, what they're doing is promoting the kind of systems in which Alina, Chelsea, and Jamie were trapped, brutalized, and abused. And these pro-sex trade lobbyists are not just made up of so-called sex worker coalitions, but in fact include some of the most highly regarded human rights organizations on the planet, including the World Health Organization, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Open Society Foundation, and the American Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU. How do these pro-sex trade lobbyists justify supporting such abusive systems? They claim that legalizing or decriminalizing the sex trade will reduce societal stigma around prostitution. They say that women have the right to do any kind of work they want, that so-called sex work is real work, and participating in sex work is an expression of bodily autonomy. And they contend that decriminalizing will improve the health and safety and financial stability of people in prostitution without increasing human trafficking. All of these contentions are utterly false. In 2007, Carolyn Maloney, a Democratic congresswoman from New York and founder of the Human Trafficking Caucus in the United States Congress, wrote about the consequences of the legalization of prostitution in and around the gambling mecca of Las Vegas. Once upon a time, she wrote, there was the naive belief that legalized prostitution would improve life for prostitutes, eliminate prostitution in areas where it remained illegal, and remove organized crime from the business. Like all fairy tales, this turns out to be sheer fantasy. The problem for pro-sex trade lobbyists, that is, those who advocate for legalizing or decriminalizing the sex trade, is that any arguments that legalizing prostitution is better for prostituted individuals and society are belied by evidence from the countries and jurisdictions where prostitution is actually legal. Besides the locations I've already mentioned, these include the Netherlands, Denmark, and the UK. The experiences of these countries demonstrate the catastrophic impact of legal prostitution on women and girls, on vulnerable people, and on society. As researchers and survivors of the sex trade have found, prostitution is not a job like any other, and so-called sex work is not real work, as it is premised on the power imbalance between pimps and brothel owners and johns, or sex buyers, on the one hand, and people in prostitution, who are mostly women and girls, on the other. Alina's, Chelsea's, and Jamie's stories demonstrate the vulnerability of people in prostitution and the economic and social power imbalance that results. Alina was impoverished and victimized by threats that her family would be harmed. That meant that she couldn't say no to anything and was forced to hand over her money to pimps. Chelsea speaks of enduring torture to avoid making Johns angry. Jamie describes having to endure mistreatment from savage and brutal men, even in what she thought would be a protected brothel environment. In a brilliant academic piece entitled Duet, Prostitution, Racism, and Feminist Discourse, two survivors of the sex trade, Vednita Carter and Evelina Gibb, state, when the job of prostitution is exposed, any similarity to legitimate work is shattered. Put simply, whether you're a high-class call girl or a street-walking hoe, when you're on a date, you got to get on your knees and lay on your back and let that man use your body any way he wants to. That's what he pays for. Any attempt to frame women's participation in the sex trade as akin to consent is just plain wrong. As Chelsea from New Zealand has so aptly said, I don't know any woman whose own personal sexuality drives her to be with a succession of strangers, catering to those strange men's desires, while struggling to uphold the very minimum of safety precautions until we are sore, swollen, chafing, and torn. This is not consent. This is coercion. This is not sex work. This is rape. This is economic exploitation. This is women's oppression. The Netherlands chose the path of legal deregulation 2 years before Germany, Both the Dutch Justice Minister and the police concede that there have been no palpable improvements for people in prostitution since then. They are generally in poorer health than before, and increasing numbers are addicted to drugs. The police estimate that 50 to 90% of people in prostitution do not practice the profession voluntarily. There is a wealth of data to show that decriminalization and legalization harm people in prostitution and society at large, and we may be able to get into that during the Q&A portion of today's seminar. But now, let's turn to the good news. Fortunately, there is a better way, as you've heard, to approach the sex trade. The approach is known as the equality model, which is also called the Nordic or the abolitionist or the end demand model. The equality model decriminalizes people in prostitution. This is very important. In other words, it protects people in prostitution, the victims of the sex trade, from being charged with crimes related to prostitution. However, it criminalizes the behavior of those who facilitate the sex trade, specifically johns, pimps, and brothel owners. The first country to adopt the equality model was Sweden in 1999. Other countries that have adopted the equality model are Norway, Iceland, Canada, Northern Ireland, France, and more recently, a couple of years ago, Israel. There is some good news from the US. This summer, Maine passed the equality model, the first state to do so in the United States. There is currently an equality model bill before the New York State Legislature. It's called the Sex Trade Survivors Justice and Equality Act. In addition to maintaining laws against pimps, johns, and brothel owners, and sex tourism, and promoting prostitution, so it maintains laws against all of those people and activities, it funds support and exit services for people selling sex, and it automatically clears convictions for people bought and sold in the sex trade. In opposition, there is a bill that would fully decriminalize prostitution in New York, misnamed the Stop Violence in the Sex Trades Act. That law would clear all convictions for johns, pimps, and brothel owners, and make it harder to investigate and prosecute cases of sex trafficking. In countries where it's been adopted, the equality model has been shown to change the social perception that women and girls are mere commodities to be bought and sold, which then delegitimizes sex buying and reduces the demand for bought sex. Sweden has seen a marked decline in demand for bought sex since it adopted the equality model in 1999, from around 14% to 7.5% of the male population. Meanwhile, since embracing full decriminalization the same year, Denmark has seen over a 40% increase in the demand for bought sex. Unsurprisingly, the data show that when demand for bought sex increases, so does sex trafficking. The number of trafficked victims in Denmark is 4 times that of Sweden, even though Sweden's population is about 40% larger than Denmark's, and even though the number of people in prostitution is also 3 to 4 times larger than in Sweden. And as Jamie's story illustrates, even fully legal prostitution looks a hell of a lot like sex trafficking, as both systems are characterized by violence, coercion, and abuse. Alina, Chelsea, and Jamie all managed to escape the sex trade, in some cases after over 2 decades enduring its brutality. Yet their physical, emotional, and mental scars testify of the horror of the trade and its devastating impacts. I encourage feminists around the globe to fight for the introduction of the equality model in order to end the demand for bought sex and the abuse and trafficking of women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. So we're at the discussion and questions section of the session. So if anybody has any questions for either Gail or Meredith, you could, let's see, yeah, just raise your hand and I'll try to see if I can, or say something if I don't see it, because I have to look at the list and see if anybody have any questions. I mean, I could kick it off for a question for Gail that I have. And that is, what kinds of laws what would the laws do to have an equality model that addressed pornography specifically?
Well, you would do exactly what Meredith said. You would basically decriminalize the women in pornography, and then you would criminalize the porn owners, the pimps, and the buyers. So it would be exactly the same model, because it's a revolving door. Pornography, prostitution, trafficking, it's all one big mush together. So if we use that, we could just mean redefining a pornographer as a pimp in an Armani suit. We redefine the women for what's happening as being pimped out, trafficked, and prostituted. And we redefine the consumer of pornography to be a John. So you've got it there. Can people turn their cameras on, by the way, so we can have some interactive?
People feel comfortable doing that? Feel free to
If you
do
feel
that.
comfortable, yeah.
Yeah. Any thoughts or questions?
I have a suggestion, actually, because everyone's heard a lot of stuff.
I know it's a lot.
If it's useful, is just put in to the chat how you're feeling, sort of get it out.
Feel free to do that.
It's heavy stuff, you know, and sometimes it helps.
Yeah.
Upset, angry, I mean, just go for it. And so we get a sense of where people are at.
Right. Right. So do we want to see, anybody have any questions or comments? There must be, there's so much here to absorb. It's very intense. So does anybody, or we can go around and see if anyone has something to say and
Validated, angry.
yeah, I got Diane who's here. Can you get, yeah, I got Diane's here and she has a question. Can you, let me just.
That's all right, you can say.
Okay.
I just keep making a connection in my head about one particular circumstance that I've been reading a lot about and talking a lot about with other lesbian feminists. And that is, we have a lot of young women who are amputating their breasts and taking poisonous hormones in order to be boys. And of course, they can never be boys, but I'm wondering if this is also a response to the way girls are treated and harassed, and they see their future as something ugly, like all these things we're talking about. Do you have any information about that?
I don't personally, I mean, it makes perfect sense. Okay, I have not seen any research on the consumption of pornography and its relationship to transitioning from female to male, but it would seem to me that given the way that women and girls are treated in this culture, why wouldn't you want out of this body? Why wouldn't you say, get me the hell out of here? Because, I mean, to see your body just destroyed like that, what does it do to, and we know that increasingly girls are going to pornography to look, not to masturbate, but to see what the guys are watching so they can perform porn sex on them. So they're getting terrified by it, right? It's what the studies are finding is it's terrifying them. So there's a whole you know, range of impact that this has. I don't know, but if you've got anything, Meredith, any studies?
No, I haven't come across any studies on that point, but I agree that particularly when you're thinking about the sex trade, there's a clear power imbalance between men and women and how women are portrayed in relation to men in the sexual context. So that has to be very disturbing for young girls.
Yeah. Okay, looks like Lisa has her hand up.
Yes, and what does that say about men who want to be women? You know, we have both sides of that, so it's kind of interesting. As a, you know, maybe as a fetish to being having unequal power. I don't know.
Well, again, there's no research, and that's a small percentage. I mean, the biggest percentage here is the victims of violence, women victims of male violence. So, I mean, I think sticking to this topic around how are we going to stop men doing what they do? You know,
But I
what
also think, but I also think it's connected to why men are picking up guns and just taking out grocery stores and other
I
things.
agree. I agree. This is the masculinity that we're training them into. I mean, violent, no empathy, no compassion. That's what you need to pick up a gun and go to a school or go to a supermarket. I mean, and no one, and you know, it always amazes me when we hear about another shooting and we sort of conjure up in our mind's eye what it is. We never think of a woman taking that. It's a given that it's a male, but yet it's hidden. It's hidden.
Yeah.
Because could you imagine if tomorrow a slew of women and girls started doing the same thing? Everyone would be asking what's wrong with girls and women.
Well, you also made the connection between sex and hunting and fetish of guns as an extension of the body. So that's a pretty interesting rabbit hole when you start looking at that also.
Absolutely.
So I think Heidi had her hand up. And
Yes.
then when you're done, just take that little hand down.
Oh, thank you so much. This is really eye-opening and horrifying. I guess I'm most interested in education of young boys and women, you know, girls, because I live in Arizona. I don't even know if they have sex ed. So I know kids are just getting their sex ed from porn, which is not healthy at all. And I saw you have a program that's going to start. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like I should be a facilitator because I don't mind talking about it.
Well, our new program is exactly about this. It's about exploitation, sexual exploitation. It's really, and it comes with a whole package of how to train the teacher to do this. We even have PowerPoints that the teacher can give in class, that the teacher can customize. It's a holistic sex education program, but it's filtered, it's specifically focused on a porn critical lens. And one of the reasons it took us about 1.5 years to write this and get it uploaded, and it looks really great, and it's on a very accessible LMS, was that in England, I live in the United States, but in England, they've mandated sex ed, and they've not given enough materials or enough training. And so what has stepped in are private companies, and people were writing to me, showing me the sex ed that they were selling to schools, things like pornography is like chocolate, right? You can have some of it, but don't have too much. This is for 13 to 18-year-olds. Another one said, there's no evidence to show that pornography has harms. Well, let me tell you, I've been studying this for nearly 40 years now, and I've just actually finished writing a legal declaration for a certain state that's being sued by the porn industry. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies just in the last 2 years. So anyone who argues there's no evidence is lying, right? Either willfully or doesn't know what's going on. But oftentimes I find it's willful refusal to accept the data. I mean, because we do live in a post-truth society where anything you want to say goes. If you feel it, then that's a good enough reason to express it. Which of course we all know where that's coming from, and the far right and QAnon and all of that. So it's getting very hard for science to find its footing as providing facts. We're more happy to just give in to how we think and how we feel. So anyway, our sex ed program will be live within the month. So as I said, if you go to culturereframed.org and sign up for our newsletter, or just write to us to ask us when it will become live, and you will get an email.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So Dina, you got your hand up.
Hi, thank you so much. This is actually Dee. So glad to be here, and wow, what a great great information. Not new, sadly, but really really useful. I actually had this on a different device, so I'm a little distracted by the echo. So I had several questions, and I'll just throw them out there, and then whoever wants to answer. One of them is the sex industry, porn and prostitution. I guess I was interested in, like, structurally the industries, like how they are. I mean, clearly we can see how they're interrelated, but I'm actually interested in their business, organization. Like, do they have industry organizations with annual conferences, and like how and where do they do their banking, sort of like what the business structure is, and if we have any information about that. And then the other thing is, how is Sussex University in UK, the gender studies pro prostitution scholars there, and then AIDS prevention programs, like sort of where does all of that fit into each other? I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Want to comment?
I can do the first one. Meredith, do you want to do the second one?
Sure, yes.
Okay, so actually there's an article that I'm going to, when I finish speaking and Meredith starts, I'm going to put into the chat. So I've taken an approach of value chains, which is what economists take. But the more radical economists look at harm chains and that means you examine from production right through to distribution, what are the points in the chain? How is the product sourced? How is it produced? How is it distributed? So let me give you and the analysis looks at this exact question. What is the similarities between porn and prostitution, and what are the differences? The similarities around recruitment: poor women, refugee women, women who have been sexually abused, disproportionately women of color. The actual production is different because you've got cameras, you've got a whole infrastructure that produces the image. The distribution is also different. You have MindGeek, which is the Amazon of the porn industry, basically built the infrastructure of the porn industry. Now, the business model of pornography, and mainly MindGeek, because it is above ground, means it can get access to lots of money, venture capital. It has its own shows. It has lots of shows all over the world. The biggest one is in Nevada, in Las Vegas, every January. I have to say I've been to a couple, and it's like you've dropped down the rabbit hole. Also, the porn industry has its own lobbying arm called the Free Speech Coalition, which is basically paid for by MindGeek, because that's where the money is concentrated in the porn industry. And the Free Speech Coalition is a lobbying arm which brings a lot of laws together. At the moment, the first state in the United States to demand age verification, where you have to show with a third party that you are 18 or above for pornography. The first law was passed in Louisiana about, I think, almost a year ago. And it was a law copied from the UK, France, other countries. Anyway, it got passed. I was working with the Louisiana state government to get that passed. Anyway, now the Free Speech Coalition, who gets most of its money from MindGeek, is suing the state of Louisiana, arguing that it infringes on the free speech and makes it cumbersome to get onto a porn site. So actually what I've been doing all day for the last 3 days is writing a legal declaration against the Free Speech Coalition for the state of Louisiana. There's now 17 states at play bringing in the age verification law. Now, it might sound not much to you. What the age verification is you have to go to a third-party age verifier with either a birth certificate or something, and you have to have a selfie, and they have to check it's you, and then you have to get a digital chip or something, and then that data has to be uploaded to a porn site before they can allow you on, and that's for everybody. So it is, I mean, it will take a lot, not a lot, but it means you can't just go on a porn site for free within 3 seconds. They're fighting that. I think it is critical that we get this passed in these 17 states, because the porn industry is totally unregulated. The reason they are fighting this is they know that the first piece of regulation is a foot in the door. This is a major foot in the door to regulate. So that's why we've been working so hard to get this passed, because this is just the, once you regulate, once you have one regulation, then you've got the foot in the door. I mean, if you can believe that pornography is completely unregulated at the site of production and at the site of consumption. So this is an attempt to change that. Then I'll hand it over to Meredith, who can discuss the second one.
Thanks, Gail. Well, look, I'm not terribly familiar with the Sussex University academics' position, but I imagine that, like with a lot of universities, some of the academics there, if not all of them, take a pro-prostitution stance and support full decriminalization or legalization of the sex trade. I know that's a very, very popular position, and it's one that's really fed to students. So a lot of university students accept this argument that's presented that women, in order to exercise autonomy, in order to have choice, in order to have bodily control, should be allowed to be so-called sex workers or work in the sex industry, and that that's a positive and healthy thing. And that is, of course, a lie, as we know from many, many survivors of the sex trade, in addition to many researchers who have looked deeply into the studies of the harms of the sex trade to women and girls. But that academic position is very, very difficult to reconcile, and I have spent some time trying to sort of grapple with this. And I think what Gail said earlier really goes to this as well, that a lot of people are acting on emotion or believing what they want to believe, despite the evidence to the contrary. They're sort of manipulating data to suit their narrative. I've looked in some detail at what lobbyists like the ACLU say about the sex trade. And honestly, they take, first of all, they're very selective in the studies that they discuss. So they don't look at information from survivors of the sex trade. That's the first thing. In addition, they overwhelmingly rely on studies or information from sex worker, so-called advocates. So they look at lobbyists who are in favor of expanding and decriminalizing the sex trade, and they take what those lobbyists say at face value, which of course is very biased and very dangerous. And then in addition, they look at studies that are out there and they manipulate them. So for example, the ACLU has put forward a study that was done around the legalized sex trade in Nevada, because there are certain counties in Nevada where the sex trade is legal. In fact, that's the only place in the US currently where the sex trade is legal. And they found that a legalized environment did not increase violence against women, but and didn't, cause other significant harmful outcomes to women in prostitution. But it turned out that they were just looking at small snippets of this study. They were only going into brothels and interviewing women where brothel owners were consenting and women had been advised in advance. And essentially what we know happens is, in decriminalized and legalized systems, brothel owners and pimps will coach women on what to say about their experience there, and will threaten women to present a certain story about their reality. And so all of that bias was introduced in this study that the ACLU relied on. And there are many, many more examples. There was another study, and I'll try to sort of wrap this up. There was another study out of Rhode Island where some indoor prostitution was briefly legalized in, I believe it was the late 90s or early 2000s. And that the ACLU points to a study of that period that seems to suggest that rates of sexually transmitted diseases and infections reduced under a legalized system in Rhode Island. However, the study failed to consider the fact that this STI-STD rate had actually begun to reduce before legalization occurred, and it continued to drop after legalization. So they didn't look at the full data set. They just truncated it to a convenient piece and then twisted that data to make it look like legalization of the sex trade was good for the health of people in prostitution. And we see this kind of manipulation time and time again, and it's surprisingly easy to find. All you need to do, as I did, was read the ACLU's research paper on the sex trade and then look at the articles that it cites. And you see that the articles that it cites have, in many cases, been taken out of context. So to get myself back on track, essentially, I do think that there's perhaps a level of cognitive dissonance, or there's just a denial by many sort of mainstream lobbyists and academics to deny the harmful realities of the sex trade. And maybe it's also in some ways just very politically convenient to do so. But it is really difficult to understand, because as soon as you start getting into the research from survivors, the research, the very comprehensive research that is done by some wonderful academics around the world, you start to see the true harms of the sex trade and how horrific those are on women.
No, as well, I just want to say one thing as well. If you're in an academia, you have to get tenure, which means that you have to publish. And it is almost impossible to publish anything that is critical of pornography or prostitution today. So you can't make tenure. I mean, there's a few journals here and there, but they're not listed in the top journals that actually do allow some critical pieces. But I can't tell you how many times I have been turned down by journals, how many times my op-eds have been turned down, and then you get the next day some stupid article about pornography where they don't even know what they're talking about. They've clearly spent a couple of weeks just researching it, not 30 odd years. So I think the tenure process, and also whenever I go to speak in colleges and some professor gets up and says to me, you know, about sex work, I said, look, I'm a bit confused here. You did a PhD to get your job. It takes many years and it's very grueling, and you've amassed an enormous amount of debt. If you're so pro sex work, why did you bother doing a PhD? Why didn't you go out at 14 and start making a living if you think it's such a great work? Because it's, you know why? Because it's okay for other women and it's okay for other women's daughters. It's just not my kind of thing for me or my daughter. It's classist, it's racist, it's elitist. They're in cozy jobs in the academy, and yet they are, you know, enforcing and that belief that somehow these women who do sex work are having a wonderful time, having lots of sex and fun. It makes me crazy to be around these women, I'll be honest.
So I have some people with hands up. Bogota.
Hi, yeah, actually my question is very like in this topic. I'm a PhD student and it's really overwhelmingly liberal and pro-defensive, like the whole discourse. So I think my question was just like, if you have any advice on like how to keep sane in this kind of environment while trying to make or like do anti-pornography research. And yeah.
You have to find yourself sisters who agree with you, right? You absolutely do. It's the only way you stay sane in academia around this and it's not liberal, it's neoliberal, it's actually reactionary, all of that stuff. I would look around for, where are you located?
I'm in Sweden, so there are
there's great
like,
groups in Sweden. Yeah, Unizon, you know Unizon?
Yeah.
To you. I mean, I go to Sweden all the time. Unizon brings me. I used to be there all the time, and before COVID, go to Unizon. You want to stay sane? And if you really want an introduction, I can give you an introduction to Unizon if you don't know them.
I know some. Yeah.
You do, and Tolita is great in Sweden. So actually, you're in the best place in the world to stay sane. Just get out, just go to university, do what you have to do. What's your dissertation on?
So I'm looking into sexuality education programs and how they discuss pornography or not, or
Well,
yeah.
you should get in touch with us. We can help you.
Yeah.
And you can see our new sex education program as well. And we've also got articles on best practices for sex education. So there's a lot of stuff we can help you with.
Thank you.
So Lee,
Yes, hi. I am just so speechless and blown away. I'm so grateful. Thank you to Feminist and Struggle. Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Gail. Thank you for your work and your voices. You're so eloquent. I'm overwhelmed just, with all of the processing this. I mean, I'm also a survivor. I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and of commercial exploitation of female sexuality. And I see this like where I went to college, I went to an Ivy League college, and there was still solicitation for prostitution for Ivy League students, for Ivy League females to help pay their tuition. There was solicitation to buy eggs, for surrogacy and stuff. And anyway, from what I've learned in my research, also just even to heal my life, what I really appreciated both of you included in your language is the capital, and the capitalism, the commercial exploitation of commodifying, female bodies, and how you just blew my mind when you showed how when it's above ground and it's taken, when it has access to capital and it's taken into market, and then how it infiltrates our societies, our children's lives. And then, just looking politically at where we're at on our planet, with women's rights in America right now being outlawed, and the sort of runaway Supreme Court, and the $1 trillion military budget for the Pentagon, and looking at the capitalists who profit from war, how army bases turn local women into prostitutions, how trafficking is so common around military bases and war zones and refugee camps, and all of the displacement of people that makes capitalists money. They have the structures of profit, especially among the war corporations. So, and then just also looking at the military as being the most polluting fossil fuel, generator force on the planet. I guess, then I just try to feel some hope for how we can take our planet back, take our women and girls back, take back our rights, take back our voices. Yeah, I love your books, and just thank you so much for your work.
thank you, Lee.
Thank you. Let me say one thing. There's a great documentary out. I can't remember the name, but basically it's around the idea that if capitalism was a person, it would be a psychopath. And they kind of take apart what a psychopath is and apply it to capitalism, which is exactly the case, I think. And really, capitalism and war zones is they've created a war zone on women, right? There's no, unlike any other war, there's no ceasefires, there's no front lines, there's nothing. This is a war that has gone on from time immemorial, and we don't see any. And you know what? We haven't even had a ceasefire for, as Andrea Dworkin said, 24 hours,
Indigo.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. All right, so I'm rather new to this topic. I have very limited knowledge of it. So I'm probably coming in with a rather novice question, but if you'll bear with me. So I'm listening to what you were saying and considering what you were saying, Meredith, about the equality model. And so of the very little I knew before coming here, if I may read a single paragraph to you out of the article that probably informed me the most on this topic previously. It says, prostitution remains illegal in California, but police have lost significant ground in the effort to contain it, thanks to Governor Gavin Newsom's repeal of the state anti-loitering statute. It says, Sergeant Marcos Campos of the Oakland Police Department told me that his force rescued 24 underage girls from the streets in 2021. But in 2022, that number dropped to 14, most from before the law was signed. Since I believe July, this is a quote of him, since I believe July, when we were officially told it passed, we have been directed by the district attorney's office to not arrest for statute 653.22, which is loitering, he said. So this is with reference to SB 357. So I guess my thought is, I understand the idea of not criminalizing the women, the victims, but it was seeming from my understanding of that article that the criminality of they were able to be approached, right? If you just simply saw someone working the streets, the police had an excuse to approach, and then they maybe could get the girls away from the pimps and then give them a chance to be rescued. So I'm trying to reconcile these two things, and I'm wondering if there's anything that you can provide as insight. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Indigo, and that's a fantastic question. I believe I've actually read that article. I may have read it in the lead up to this seminar. I've not read the new law that Governor Newsom introduced. However, I would say that under the equality model, the idea is that police resources are really redirected away from people in prostitution and towards all those who facilitate the system. So pimps, brothel owners, and sex buyers, and particularly pimps when you're talking about street-based prostitution. So instead of police softening their efforts, they should be just redirecting and using the available mechanisms to apprehend people involved in the sex trade. Now, one thing that we find in decriminalized systems and legalized systems is it seems those systems seem to heighten the level of control that pimps and brothel owners have on people in prostitution. So people in prostitution don't necessarily want to come forward to police and report abuses against them. Suddenly there's not an appetite from law enforcement to follow up on these sorts of crimes at all. The political will, the mandate, it's just not there. So in the equality model system, people in prostitution actually feel more empowered to go to police and use them as an ally and say, this has happened or that's happened, please investigate it. And there's some research out of Sweden and other countries with the equality model that describes that process and backs that up. So I guess resource redirection is important. Now, I'm not sure what the political climate is in relation to the sex trade in California, and others might be able to jump in here, but it's possible that at the same time as this loitering law was repealed, there's been a lack of focus from government on regulating or prosecuting perpetrators within the sex trade. So that might have something to do with the the apparent sort of softening of the police approach towards trafficking. But ideally, what we see and what we want to see in a system with the equality model is that there'll be a recommitment to that kind of law enforcement. I mean, there are definitely issues that police bring. You know, survivors of the sex trade have certainly reported that there can be police brutality against people in prostitution, that police can turn a blind eye. You know, there are all kinds of issues there. But at the same time, there is a necessary role for police to play in identifying this behaviour and charging those responsible and reducing it. So the equality model and the bill that was introduced in New York actually talks about training for police and law enforcement officials and other frontline type workers in this space, so that there will be a greater awareness of the nuances of trafficking, you know, how trafficking happens, what trafficking victims look like, and the interplay between trafficking and the sex trade, because we would say, as equality model advocates, that there is very little difference generally between prostitution and trafficking. So greater training needs to happen, as well as there being, you know, a renewed political effort. I'm not sure if that's answered the question, but if anyone has anything else they'd like to add.
Yes, thank you.
So Fran had her
Thanks,
hand
Andrea.
up. You gotta unmute.
Okay, hi, I've got a fan on. I'm absolutely need it without an air conditioner in this weather, so I hope it's not drowning me out. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Meredith and Gail, for these excellent presentations. I'm very proud, actually, to have introduced Meredith to this, because she was on the show that I produced at WBAI on feminism. And Gail has been a guest many times. So I'm so happy this is happening. Besides the horror of hearing these descriptions once again, and it always hurts me afresh to hear about it. I guess I spend a lot of time blocking it out, not thinking about it, as most of us do, because it's just overwhelming. Apart from that, on a political level, I really feel a great horror at the way the left has swallowed this sex worker line, and particularly what you were saying, Meredith, about listing the organizations that, you know, line up, that we otherwise in many ways do a very, very wonderful work, right? But here they are, the ACLU, Amnesty International, the Democratic Socialists of America, who are a growing group, who have a terrible line on just about everything feminist, from transgenderism to surrogacy, you know, all this kind of nouveau, that all this stuff is somehow liberating. And I think, you know, we really have to get beneath the surface on where that came from, because that is culturally generated really out of the 60s, I think, in the midst of the sexual revolution, which turned out to be sexual revolution for men and not for women. But the other thing that really concerns me about the left being so complicit is that it gives the right a great field to operate in and to get more adherence. And I believe that ultimately the right is the larger enemy of women, because if you look at history, you know, you see that in all countries that really did have left revolutions, one of the first things they did was they tried to eliminate prostitution, which Karl Marx was very clear about being a form of exploitation, of ultimate exploitation of women. You know, he wasn't so great on certain aspects of feminism, but he, you know, got that one right, and that was followed in all socialist countries. So you think the left would have those who actually are a little more left than the Democrats, who really aren't. Let's say somebody like the Democratic Socialists of America. You'd think they'd have a vested interest in emphasizing that history, going back to the source of their leftism, right? And I don't see that. And Gail, of course, who I saw at the Left Forum, you were wonderful, Gail, that was a while ago, it's always clear that she is a Marxist. And Gail, I hope you keep saying that, because we have such a conundrum now with the right wing taking up so many aspects that seem in some ways to actually be feminist, even though I feel they're exploiting all those issues. And, even though they get it right occasionally, where they're really coming from is against women. So I want to say two things. One is that women will start to respond to the ACLU, the DSA, which prides itself on being a membership group, right, which should care about what people are saying, even join them and start fighting back against some of these atrocious positions, because they're just kind of relying on, quote, experts and then naive myths about how all this is sexually liberating. We have to fight back on the left and take that territory back from the right. And I know that's a very big job, but I just really want to put that out there. And the other thing I want to put out there is that I hope people will support the program that I and with a number of co-hosts have produced on WBAI for 21 years, which is attempting to have some authentic feminism on a left-wing radio station, right, a non-commercial station. And I just in the chat put, when it's on, et cetera, because we could be just snuffed out, including for our views. I mean, I've had Anne on talking about how she was fired from her job for mentioning women as a sex class. I have views on there that the show can very well be attacked for at any point. So I hope people will listen to it and support it. And that's what I want to say right now. Thank you.
So I actually had a couple of questions and comments. If I don't see anybody else with their hands up. One is I want to make a comment supporting what Fran said.
AI.org.
Supporting what Fran said about the left, having been and still am a socialist my whole life. When I was in socialist groups many decades ago, there was always a consensus that prostitution was a bad thing and we wanted to end it. There was a debate on how to do that. And at that point, they didn't really have the idea of the equality model. So we debated, decriminalization, things like that. But the aim was the same. It wasn't a good thing. And so the big change, besides the fact that there's a good option now that's been thought through, is that now people who claim to be left are saying prostitution is cool. Prostitution is a wonderful choice. So that's a huge change that happened over a period of time. And then I want to make a comment about sex education. There's been a lot of people saying that the sex education happening is pornifying, is pornography, and it's grooming and things like that. And there's a tendency by people who are, probably would characterize being on the right, but I don't want to oversimplify things because it's complicated, but who basically think there shouldn't be any sex education. And getting back to that, and I'm really glad to hear some good sex education, because I haven't completely thought through what a good sex education would look like. So it's really, really pleased to hear that there is something like that, because I think there should be sex education, and I don't doubt that the stuff being taught isn't so good right now. So anyway, that's good. And then I have a kind of a question, having been in debates decades ago about free speech and pornography, and with everyone on the room coming from pornography is not good, we don't like it, but how do we fight it? And so I think the easier question is when there's the camera going on, and so then it's basically film prostitution with people being prostituted. And the harder question is when it is still some print or even a cartoon, and how do you how do you grapple with the free speech implications, I guess?
Well, it's hate speech. I think you could argue it's hate speech when it's not real people, but that would be it. It's hate speech, just as any other form of speech that incites violence against a minority group is considered hate speech. I also want to talk about my favorite topic, which is Marxism, pornography, the left, and all of that. I mean, I want to say that it seems to me that leftists who've got a good Marxist analysis of the means of production and all of that, it seems their brains fall out when it comes to pornography. Literally, their brains fall out. And what's interesting is you cannot talk about pornography without talking about capitalism. It exists to monetize women's bodies. If there was no profit involved, they'd move on to something else. Same with prostitution, it's about profit. And, you know, when you're a left-winger, you understand all about the profit motive. You understand that capitalism will do anything to maximize profits. So if it means destroying the planet, so be it. That's what they'll do. And what's interesting is, would those on the left, when they're looking at the sort of terrible working conditions of people in Amazon, would they go and interview them with their boss standing next to them, which is what they do with women who've been prostituted? They do it with the pimp surrounding them in their brothel. So, I mean, it would be like me going into an Amazon delivery service and saying, you know, I'd like to speak to the manager. Could you take me to some workers? And he's standing there or she's standing there as the workers start to tell, quote, the truth. Of course, they're going to say they love it, right? Otherwise, they'll lose their jobs. And for women who have been trafficked, they'll lose their lives, probably more so than just their jobs. So, I mean, I wrote an article years ago that's still up with Bob Jensen about why pornography is a left issue. If you just put that into Google, why pornography is a left issue, by GAIL Dines and Bob Jensen. And it was written originally for Z Magazine, which I don't even know if Z Magazine is still going anymore. It was a Marxist socialist paper. But I mean, you know, I myself, all my life, has been a socialist, absolutely. And that's why I do this work. It's not that I have to grapple with being a socialist to do this work. It's the opposite. It's the obvious work to do when you're a socialist and when you're a radical feminist. It's the absolute obvious work.
Yeah. So is there anybody else who has a question? Otherwise, we'll ask for some final thoughts by Meredith and Gail and then wrap up. I'm not seeing any.
And I noticed a couple of questions in the chat that I wanted to just quickly speak to.
Sure.
One's from Anne Fishley, who's a good friend of mine. Thanks for being here, Anne. She asked whether pornography use leads to increased demand for bought sex. And I would say, absolutely, it does. And in fact, Gail's presentation, well, all of it really struck me, but particularly where she talked about the fact that once men are used to more ordinary pornography, they quickly get bored and their appetite for gonzo porn grows. And that leads them towards child abuse and viewing child pornography. And I think it's very similar in the and obviously this is all one big trade and industry, as we've discussed, but you see with bought sex that people, punters, buyers want to just buy sex, and then they want to buy increasingly bizarre and dangerous and violent acts, and then they want to buy sex with children. And children are trafficked into the trade to suit that demand. And so there's a really direct and clear correlation between those things. And what we also notice in the trade is that most people have been trafficked in as children. Most women, there are plenty of peer-reviewed studies to suggest that. There's a very good study by a guy called Darren Geist on Amnesty's position on the sex trade, and he talks about how the reality that many minors under 18, mostly girls, are trafficked into the trade, and then there's this ridiculous assumption that once a woman turns 18, she's suddenly a willing participant in the sex trade and offering full consent, and that instead of being coerced, she's now autonomous. And that's obviously a lie. So anyway, that's just to get to Anne's question. And then someone had asked a question about whether there are men involved in protecting women from pornography and prostitution. And in my experience, there certainly are. I'm part of a group called New Yorkers for the Equality Model, or NIFEM, and it's basically a coalition of organizations and individuals who are trying to pass the equality model in New York. And there are some great men in that group. There's a judge in New York State. There's a man called Christian Eduardo, who is a survivor of the sex trade himself and does very, very powerful advocacy. So there are certainly men involved in the effort, and that's good to see. And I think that there need to be more, and this can be a concerted effort. But of course, women and girls have a very important and particular perspective, needs to be heard.
So it looks like there's one person with their hand up. I don't know if that's Dee or Dina. And then we should probably just get final comments by the speakers and then wrap up.
Hi,
Yeah,
thank
hi,
you so
Dee.
much.
Hi.
Yeah, this is Dee. Thank you so much. Okay, so I had a couple more. One was, I was actually also going to make a reference to the Amnesty International position, and that it's been exposed that it was actually prostitution industry owners in Northern England who made a concerted campaign to infiltrate Amnesty, and then carried out that campaign to its successful conclusion. And I think it may be Julie Bindel, I'm not sure, that that exposed that. And then I was also going to mention there's someone who's listed online as being an international expert on sexual violence, named Anna Salter. And I noticed,
yeah, she's great.
yeah. But the thing is I think that what I've seen her saying that is that all sexual violence is caused by a tiny percentage of the population. And maybe I'm misremembering what I saw her say, but I've seen that myth before. We wouldn't have the statistics we have, and certainly the situation we're describing today. So I think that's like I guess that's a popular myth. I was also going to mention RAIN, that national organization, and I can't remember what it stands for. Abuse and Incest Network, I think, that also I'm very concerned because it seems that it is, well, it's been run by a man for a really long time, and doesn't seem to have a feminist position. And then I know I'm just kind of babbling here, but the last thing is that back in the Middle Ages, when the Catholic Church and the elites wanted to put down the peasant rebellions, what they did was they started the witch hunts and the witch burnings, and were able to break the peasants up that way by turning the men and women against each other, decriminalizing rape, and anyway, so it feels like we may be sort of in a new version of that, of the way that men are being encouraged to be violent, so that basically of the 99%, the men are being used to hold down the women, and we're so busy fighting with each other, we don't notice what the elites are doing. And I'll stop with that. Thank you.
So, by the way, Anna Salter's book called Predators is fantastic. You're right. I don't know if she said it, but a few of the people in the field say the same thing, that a small percentage of men are causing the violence. That might have been true 20 years ago. It's certainly not true today. Right? Date rape has become normalized, partly through pornography, partly through other discourses. But if she did say that, I think she's not up with the data at the moment. But it's definitely, her book on predators is an incredible read. Incredible read.
So why don't we see if Gail and Meredith have some final comments? Meredith, do you have anything else you'd like to say or respond to anything that anybody else said?
Thank you, Anne. I'm just reviewing my notes quickly here. I think we've touched on some really key issues, some really important points have been made. I would stress that I really appreciated that Gail talked about the fact that we're seeing that men are actually getting off on hateful sex acts towards women. And that is also a theme in the survivor material that we see from experiences with the sex trade, that women talk about how the men that came for sex and bought sex from them seemed to most enjoy demeaning and demoralizing them, and enjoyed verbally abusing them as much as they did physically abusing them. And that is a shocking reality. And as Gail says, this empathy piece is so critical to trying to claw back this wave of hatred that's being poured out on women and girls. I would love to hear from anyone. My email address is just my name, meredith.kershaw. I'll put it in the chat at gmail.com. Please reach out if you would like to keep the conversation going, and or you'd like to be connected to any resources, at least that I can help with, like the NIFEM group, or research papers or things that you think might feed out of what I've discussed. But thank you very much. It's been a real privilege to speak alongside Gail and to be with you all today.
Okay, Gail, do you have any final comments?
I just want to say, I don't know if anyone ever saw the Andrea Dworkin documentary from England, but she said, it ends by her saying the most profound thing is, does nobody miss all of these women we've lost? She said, I miss them and we want them back. And you know what? We have to do everything to get them back. And if that means dismantling the commercial sex industry brick by brick, website by website, with our fingernails, whatever it takes, we have to fight back, and we have to be courageous. And remember, patriarchy ties to strip us as our courage. The most important thing here is we be courageous, because this cannot go on. We have to fight back for our daughters, for our sisters, and for those who have lost their voice through the vile patriarchal acts of violence done to them. So if we've still got a voice, if we have managed to keep our voice, it is absolutely in the interest of radical feminism that we use this voice for those women who can't. And I'm completely fed up and done with the industry. So I'm ready to dismantle it right now, piece by piece.
Thank you, Gail. So thank you. Thanks everybody for attending. Before you leave, I wanted to pitch Feminists in Struggle. We do recruit. We want to get more young and old and middle-aged women of all races and sexual orientations to join us in organizing a grassroots national feminist organization. So if you can check out the website, feministstruggle.org, you can join. We're in the midst of some reorganizing, so we can become even more effective. And we're hoping at some point soon to be organizing our long delayed national conference. So, and also for a short time, we have a few t-shirts left. So if anybody joins, this is one of them. This was a handmade design, Feminists in Struggles on the back. You get a free t-shirt. So if you join now, so until they're gone, we have a bunch of extra. So anyway, I wanted to thank the speakers, Gail and Meredith. That was really, really fascinating and thought-provoking, and I always appreciate the participation and discussion, and the questions are really great. So thank you so much, everybody.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.